Hello everyone. I hope my voice is audible clearly to all. So, I'm Priyami Datta. I'm working as a policy advisor at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. So, I would like to begin by referring to something that Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, said in an exclusive interview in 2014. On climate change, we often don't fully appreciate that it is a problem. We think that it is a problem waiting to happen. That was more than a decade ago. Today, I would like to believe that we have moved much beyond that. Almost every country today acknowledges the impact of climate change through lived realities. And it is in this shared recognition and common concern that has brought us together for this important webinar on climate finance. However, an important question still remains. Can we say that today climate finance is something that we are waiting to happen? Commitments have been made, stocktakes have taken place, yet ambitions remain to be translated into implementation. With this thought to unpack, I would like to warmly welcome all of you to today's webinar, Climate Finance from Negotiations to Implementations. At the outset, I would like to welcome Ms. Tara Lan to offer the opening remarks to set the context for today's discussion. Tara Lan is a lead incentivizing renewables in IISD's energy program. She has over 17 years of experience in energy policy with a particular focus on subsidies and taxation. Tara's work spans a diverse set of economies, including the energy programs across countries, Canada, India, Indonesia, and South Africa. She has successfully concluded projects with the Asian Development Bank, the Facility for Oil Sector Transparency in Nigeria, the Nordic Council of Ministers, the OECD, and the World Bank, among others. Tara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Priyami. And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining this third webinar in the IISD IIM Calcutta series on climate finance. It's a pleasure to co-host this discussion today with IIM and to bring together such a strong panel of experts spanning policy, public finance, MDBs, and implementation. Focus, moving from negotiations to implementation, is exactly where climate finance conversations need to be right now. We're meeting at a critical point in time. It's 10 years after the Paris Agreement, 2 years after the first global stocktake, and shortly after COP30 and the G20 summit in Johannesburg. Expectations going into COP30, as we all know, were very high, but the outcome was different. It reflected a more fragmented geopolitical reality. Climate finance remains central to ambition, yet the gap between needs and delivery is still stark, particularly for developing and emerging economies that face the greatest climate risks. The global investment gap between now and 2030 is around 7 trillion a year. Obviously, there's different estimates, and this is to keep the world on track for net zero. And the gap is even larger going from 2030 to 2050. Headline global figures like this are great for articulating the scale of the challenge and for getting media headlines, but they mask major differences at the regional and national level. In emerging market and developing economies outside China, the gap is widest and the investment needs are over 8 times higher than 2023 climate financial flows. This is approximately twice the gap that exists in advanced economies. India alone needs around 170 billion a year to meet its climate goals. Access to affordable and secure financing to meet these investment needs is absolutely critical, especially for emerging market and developing economies that face higher costs of commercial capital and fewer domestic funding resources. So, what did COP30 and G20 do to address this finance gap? Well, COP30 focused on operationalizing the new Collective Quantified Goal on climate finance and the Baku to Belém roadmap, with a strong emphasis on public-private participation. There were some important signals, particularly on adaptation, including the call to triple adaptation finance by 2035. So there was some highlights. COP30 also emphasised the importance of mitigation and adaptation working together. At the same time, a lot of questions remain resolved. How will finance be mobilised at scale? How will credible delivery be ensured? And how does global commitments how do they become translated into national investment pipelines? The G20 reinforced this challenge, calling for a shift from billions to trillions, with a strong emphasis on MDB reform, risk sharing and concessional finance. So at IISD, our work primarily focuses on how public financial support is designed, governed and deployed to unlock clean energy investment at scale. That means looking beyond headline pledges to the mechanics of finance, public budgets, subsidies, guarantees, state-owned enterprise investments, MDB instruments, policy frameworks that shape the risks and returns. As Professors Mohanty and Saka, our co-panelists and moderators, emphasise in their book, Financing Climate Action, effective climate action is not just about mobilising more capital, it's also about building financial systems, institutions, public-private arrangements that can reliably channel finance towards low-carbon and climate-resilient development. With that in mind, today's panel brings together expertise across UNFCCC finance processes, public finance and fiscal policy, MDB operations, and country-level implementation. We're very lucky to have this skilled panel to address this issue with us. I'm especially looking forward to the discussion that goes beyond global numbers to address differentiated needs in the global south, from MICs to SIDS to sub-Saharan Africa, and what that means for institutions and reforms. And with that, I'll hand over to our moderator, Professor Mohanty, to lead our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Tara. Yeah. Professor Mohanty, would you mind if I introduce you as well as the panelists, as well as the
Not at all.
housekeeping?
Please go right ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Tara. Thank you so much for all your insightful remarks, as well as for so precisely setting the context for the discussions today. So we are also privileged. We will now have our panel discussion on the implications of COP30 and 2025 G20 Summit on global climate finance, with a focus on the differential needs of the global South countries. The panel will be moderated by Professor Mrityunjay Mohanty. He retired in September 2024 as a professor of economics at the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. Outside of climate change, he is currently also researching the comparative study growth trajectories of China and India and nature and pattern of their integration into the global economy. We are also privileged to be joined by an outstanding list of panelists today, starting with Deepak Dasgupta. He is a distinguished fellow with the Earth, Science and Climate Change Division of the Energy and Resource Institute, TERI, a member of the Scientific Council to the COP30 Presidential. He chairs the Eastern Green Finance Hub in India under preparation, the first on subnational climate finance for 12 plus states and 400 plus million population in the East and Northeast India, facing high climate change risk. Mr. Dasgupta was member of the core writing team, synthesis report of the 6th assessment IPCC, lead author of its working group 3 mitigation report, and a founding board member of the Green Climate Fund 2012 to 2015, the largest dedicated global fund, and chair of its board investment committee. Prior to TERI, Mr. Dasgupta was principal economic advisor to the Government of India Ministry of Finance, where he led finance negotiations at the COP. He has worked earlier with the World Bank Group for 3 decades on economic policies and investment in 5 regions and multiple countries, including India, Indonesia, China, and others. He is a recipient of Adam Smith Prize in Economics at Cambridge, the Amex Bank Review Finance Award at Singapore, and is a highly cited author on climate finance. Welcome, Mr. Dasgupta. Suranjali Tandon. Suranjali Tandon is an associate professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. She holds a PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University and specializes in research areas including direct and international taxation, sustainable finance, and financial markets. She has worked extensively with the Department of Revenue and Department of Economic Affairs, Ministry of Finance, India. She is also involved in professional activities such as being a visiting senior fellow at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment, London, and London School of Economics. She has been a member of several committees and advisory groups, including NITI Aayog's Interministerial Working Group on Climate Finance and Committee to Develop National Adaptation Plan by MOEFCC. Welcome, Suranjali. Mr. Debal Mitra is a senior manager at Climate Policy Initiative, where he leads the enabling capital practice with a focus on unlocking finance for the underserved climate positive sectors like decentralized renewable energy. He also contributed to CPI's work on green banks and carbon ratings. He comes with over 25 years of experience across varied domains of financial services like infrastructure, project finance, credit rating, and climate finance, and consulting across infrastructure, energy, and process industry. His prior engagements include leading the North India operation at a premier rating agency, supervising the risk function at an infrastructure finance company, and leading research in metals and mining as a publishing analyst in natural resources at a multinational bank. He is a BTech in chemical engineering from IIT Delhi and holds a postgraduate diploma in management from IIM Calcutta. Welcome, Mr. Mitra. Swasti Raizada. So, Swasti Raizada is a senior policy advisor at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. At IISD, her research focuses on shifting public financial flows responsibly towards clean energy in India and scaling up clean energy manufacturing. She brings over a decade of experience working on energy transition issues with a focus on public finance, solar, electric mobility, batteries, and critical minerals. She has advised key government ministries like MNRE, MOP, NITI Aayog, NTPC, CII, and ONGC, along with multilateral donors like the World Bank Climate Investment. She was previously a deputy manager at Deloitte Consulting's Energy and Resource Practices and is currently a mentor at Global Women's Network for the Energy Transition. She is an engineer by training and holds a master's in public policy. Welcome, Swasti. We will also have Dr. Dhruva Pulkayasta joining us a little later.
I did all the homework. After Salon.
May I request? Okay. So Dr. Dhruba is the advisor to the Standing Committee on Finance at the UNFCCC. He brings over 30 years of experience across engineering industries, credit rating, management, consulting, investment banking, and international development finance, with work spanning multiple countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Afghanistan, Bhutan, Philippines, Indonesia, and Korea. He has previously served as Director of Growth and Institutional Advancement at CEW and as India Director at CPI, focusing on sustainable finance and energy transition. He has also held leadership roles at IFC and World Bank in infrastructure, clean energy, SME finance, and investment climate reforms. He led the regulatory group of the Sustainable Finance Task Force under the Ministry of Finance, Government of India, and currently chairs the Climate Finance Committee at IFSCA and serves on the CII Net Zero Council for India. A visiting faculty at IIM Calcutta, Dr. Dhruva holds degrees from IIM Kolkata and a PhD from IIT Delhi in financing infrastructure and clean energy. We will soon have Dr. Dhruva joining us in some time. So a very warm welcome to Professor Mrityunjoy and all our panelists. We're truly grateful for your time and thought leadership. Our panel discussion will conclude with closing remarks by Professor Runa Sarkar. She is a professor with the Economics Group at the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. Her interest lies in sustainable development, where business interests are in consonance with environmental and social interest. She also serves as an independent director on the boards of Bandhan Financial Holdings Limited and Climate Policy Initiative and BES6 Consulting and Technology Service. So before I hand it over to Professor Mohanty to initiate the panel discussion, I would pause to take a moment for a few quick housekeeping notes for all our participants. This webinar is being recorded. The speakers may be quoted with prior approval. We also request all our participants to please post your questions in the Q&A box and not the chat box. We will have a dedicated segment following the panel discussion to address all your questions. So with this, I hand it over to Professor Mohanty.
Thank you so much, Priyami. Thank you and to IIST for collaborating with us and putting together this wonderful panel. I think we'll begin with Mr. Deepak Dasgupta. He also is short of time and we might have to leave early. So we'll start with him. Welcome, Deepak. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
And the question that we'd like you to address today is, one of the things that happened with COP was there was inability to form a consensus around the way forward. In, in the face of this, there was an important institutional evolution within the COP process in terms of formation of coalitions of the willing to tackle issues for which there was widespread support, but not necessarily a meeting of minds. In that context, your contribution to our volume about the need for regional cooperation to deal with climate change and therefore the need for regional groupings within COP was very prescient. Can you take us through how structured regional cooperation around climate change can help forge new voices within the COP process? Over to you, Deepak.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this very important session. We are discovering how to proceed as in a sense, we are writing the way we would like to proceed. Then we're having these meetings at COPs. As you rightly said, the COP is becoming a difficult place to arrive at a consensus of 187 countries to do what is obviously very urgent to do. So this idea that you can have smaller groups coalescing and trying to find the solutions themselves, bootstrapping, if you will, these coalitions are becoming quite critical. Take, for example, the work that we'd written in your volume, in which we talked about a regional effort in the Bay of Bengal covering uh, several states and countries surrounding the Bay of Bengal. And that's about 1 billion people. And there are obviously a lot of commonalities. What we've discovered since is that I think COP30 was useful in that respect. They went a step down and said at COP30, I think the idea is that you start to implement these things at some very basic and practical level. Don't worry about whether you're going to get the consensus at the COP. Start to think about forming small groups and alliances and making them practical and workable. So, what we've done in that process is we've started this subnational uh, entity that we're trying to move quite rapidly on, which is the Eastern Green Finance Hub, which covers most of this Bay of Bengal idea that we had. It is 13 major states in Eastern India. It's everything and from east, meaning the six plain states, very big plain states, and seven northeastern hill states. They're all affected and quite closely connected to changing weather patterns. So, in a sense, they're very different, but they're also very closely connected, facing similar problems. And I think the idea is scaling up a lot of the actions that these states are capable of doing, but are shy of doing for maybe three practical reasons. And these are they are aware that there is a knowledge gap in terms of what they need to do, but it's more than knowledge gap, it's also a capacity gap. So what we are hoping that the hub will do is accelerate dramatically their ability to frame uh, projects and programs that therefore starts to deliver both mitigation activities and also rapidly scale up the adaptation. Two-thirds of the projects will likely be in adaptation rather than in mitigation. So the scope is enormous. We see practically growing for, the levels of financing in climate finance in these eastern hub states that we are covering have a potential to scale up by 20 times over, let's say, a period of the next decade. More importantly, it also generates a whole new range of jobs and activities. So our discovery process in this is that it becomes quite critical to bring everyone onto the same page, which is that you are that it is possible for subnational states to do much more than they have been doing so far. Second is it is possible to scale up with some, if you will, a common frame or framing or a platform, which is what the Green Finance Hub is. It's a platform. And the third is then we start to talk to the financing side of things and get the scale up of financing that's needed from multiple sources. So that's where we are on the Eastern Green Finance Hub as a direct offshoot of what we're learning. So it's a learning by doing that we're doing. We had some ideas of what we wanted to do in the paper that we wrote in your volume. We decided we are not going to stop at just writing ideas. I mean, as an academic, I love getting citations, but much more important than citations is making sure these are actually practically possible. What you'll be also pleased to know is that cross border is much tougher. Cross state is tough, but imagine that you have to go cross border, which is you'll have to now not just subnational, you're going to have to deal with nation states across the border. What we are discovering is there it's a much tougher proposition. It is not easy to, because subnational entities can't do international kind of things except by way of passing on whatever information we have. So one thing that we've done is to initiate discussions with Sri Lankan government coming out of the cyclone Ditwa. They're in desperate need for any help they can get in terms of uh, thinking about the climate change resilience post these events, and that's also we've started doing. And one of the lessons there is that what we do in the subnational context in Eastern India is actually similar tools are available for deployment in Sri Lanka. It's very similar. You wouldn't change. You don't have to change. It's the same type. It's building that capacity, building that awareness, getting the financing together and starting to implement what we think is feasible. We are in discussion now. The next stage is we are in discussion with the financing, the bankers, the financiers, the MDBs, and we are scaling up. And with your good wishes, we will be there in as soon as we can. That's what I had to say, Professor Mohanty, which is that how do you go from an article to a COP to actual implementation on the ground at speed is really a test of our abilities, whether we actually deliver or not. That's proof of the pudding. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dasgupta, for that wonderfully informative uh, panel ideas that you've given us. It's really good to hear that the Green Financing Hub is up and running almost, and will see fruition very, very soon. And we'll follow it very closely as we were done, and hopefully there'll be lessons for other states, both cross-border and within the country. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
May I now invite Suranjali? Suranjali, the question that we have for you is COP30 will be remembered, among other things, for its focus on adaptation finance. India's federal budget, which was presented earlier this month in February for 26-27, that India's Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman presented, similarly has been praised for its focus on adaptation. Has India's climate policy begun to take adaptation seriously? What else should be done to mainstream adaptation into climate policy? Over to you, Suranjali. You have about 9 or 10 minutes. Thank you. Suranjali.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mohanty. So I think it's a great service to sort of talk about adaptation, because I think most climate conversations steer to mitigation quite swiftly. Just sort of reflecting back on the question itself, it's important to, for a moment, reflect on what we've seen as developments in this space. As you started with COP30, of course, the headline was that there is some commitment on adaptation finance, but I don't want to spend too much time dwelling on the lack of finance, which is spoken about quite frequently, but just want to highlight that setting of these targets was also quite controversial. We still have conversations around what the baseline for the tripling of the money should be, whether it's enough. And if you look at the past experience, it's about a third of that. Means that we're still staring at an abyss in the sense there's going to be some gaps there. Of course, a lot has been spoken about what is the real or significant source of adaptation finance, and almost everyone points their finger at public finances. So I think more reflection on what can each of the MDB financing for the last few years. There's a really interesting report of 2025 which compares MDBs, and what you see is that has been there's been some enhancement of their share capital, but it's about at $380 billion. So I see that even in terms of scope of where MDBs can scale up remains limited. But as a form of solution, what I could imagine is that a lot of these MDBs are generating premium. They're generating some profits from their operations, which could in fact be recycled, particularly around the adaptation side. So could there be thinking around if there's project lending, if there is some money set aside for adaptation needs. That being said, on India specifically, I think a lot has been done in the past. So if you look at India's framework for adaptation, there are the SAPCCs which existed right from 2010 to 2015. We've also updated these SAPCCs. There's also a national adaptation plan. I think what's more interesting is that there has been a vulnerability assessment and uniformity, or at least some kind of sensible way of looking at this vulnerability across India. I think for those of you interested, it might be nice to look at the 4NC that we submitted previously to the UNFCCC, and we'll be submitting one this year, which talks about all the sort of initiatives that states have begun to take in terms of recognizing the risks. And I think that's the first step in the process of dealing with adaptation needs, because it gives you a sense of where the costs are sitting. The other interesting, document to read is the economic survey this year, which also talks about a lot about adaptation. So you have different kinds of schemes where initiatives that have been undertaken across India. So that also gives you a moment to reflect on adaptation needs being very diverse across states in India. So, for example, you need products like insurance against extreme weather events for casual labor in Gujarat, or you would need funding for saving your coastline in Tamil Nadu. And so there are specific initiatives, and I think some of these perhaps may have a commercial element, and so we can think about having an MDB who collaborate with the private entity or some dedication of public resources. On the other hand, there are experiments like SEVA where there's sort of a template for using insurance, which is parametric insurance, which is very hard to scale. And in those cases, I think an assessment of the resources available at the public finance level may be quite useful to say how these initiatives can be used in pockets where heat stress may be large. If you look at the numbers again, India spends about around about 5.5% of the GDP on adaptation needs, and I think that's more than the subsidies expense for India. So I think a lot has been done in the limited constraints of public finance that we have, because it's important to highlight that India has a tax to GDP ratio which has been quite steady over the last few years, increased of course in the last 3 to 4 years, but then again within a range. You also have rethinking on subsidies, and there is a certain level of expenditure that we need to meet, and there's a fiscal cap on debt. So having said that, I think there needs to be specific interventions across the board. I guess we've started at the right end, which is to say that let's look at the risks. There are states like Odisha, for example, which also look at the fiscal risks which arise from some extreme weather events, which helps you quantify the value of resources required. But then again, it's going to be a mix. I know it sounds like a very generic answer because every particular need requires a different kind of thinking on you how you solve for this problem. So I feel like a lot of it is addressed through domestic resources, and of course it's on a case by case basis, and thirdly, of course, it's not the most commercial end of the climate conversation. So that being said, you still need public finance, at least for the most risk prone or places where there is damage to property and life. So I'll stop there and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Suranjali, for pointing out the need for diversity within financing mechanisms for adaptation in particular. And I'm sure we'll take this conversation forward in the time we have. But now may I invite Mr. Debal Mitra to come and join us. And the question we have for you, Mr. Mitra, is one of the less researched and least financed areas of a successful transition to renewables is grid connectivity. In India, grid connectivity has emerged as a serious problem, leading to both excess capacity in renewables as well as stymieing distributed renewable energy growth. Are financial flows the stumbling block or technology? What would be the best ways to improve financial flows in a manner that enables greater capacity to handle both renewable and fossil fuel energy? Greater grid capacity, that is. Mr. Mitra, over to you. You have about 9-10 minutes. Mr. Mitra?
Thanks, Professor Mohanty. And obviously, it's a topical question. Yes, grid connectivity is the key problem in RE transition because of the very nature of renewable energy supplying being intermittent and being mismatched with the peak demand. So we have, on the one hand, excess RE capacity sitting with transmission congestion and curtailment of RE because RE in its most pristine form is non-dispatchable and is curtailed first. And so I think I would say that so the optimal solution obviously is how do we kind of make RE usable, and that's where the larger part of the work is happening world over, and obviously we have India also having started late, but in terms of integrating energy storage with RE, whether it is pumped storage or battery storage, in a manner where RE is actually made usable and without really incurring heavy capex in the transmission upgrade. So we can say that the battery chemistry is continuously evolving, but in the current morphologies or current formats of lithium ion and LFP especially, there's a technology stack which is kind of adequate to take care of the technology solution. And pump storage, for example, is also a very mature technology. It has been there from 1970s. Of course, some improvements keep happening. But so I would say, if you're asking the question of whether it's technology or finance, I would say it is neither. The primary issue is more of energy planning and the appropriate project creation. So and obviously we have to be in the entire energy ecosystem or the markets. We have to be mindful of the fact that discoms remain the weakest link, and so they are a kind of a determinant for the appetite for power at a certain discovered price. And we have seen in the past few years how the market has shifted towards incorporating energy storage towards high quality power, and the institutions which are basically called the RE intermediating authorities like SECI have actually made the market and also acted as a counterparty because of the problem of the credit risk which discoms carry. So market has been quite active, although it has been in a state of flux with a lot of formats being worked upon. Like for example, round the clock 24/7 power, or what we call as a in the overall category of firm and dispatchable RE tenders, which actually tend to simulate the stable load of conventional power. And then of late, I think we have seen more of standalone BESS battery energy system tender becoming the norm, because battery costs are coming down, and also there has been a government support in form of VGF of about 40% of capex. So these are the kind of different formats which are emerging. And so when if you're looking, so we'll come down to the financing question, because that is the key point. But it is important to understand that some of these formats are actually, these formats are actually, they lend themselves to different kind of financing characteristics, although they all of them fall in a category of, I would say, project finance. But they are eliciting the attention of different kinds of players. So the RTC or the FDRE, the firm and dispatchable renewable energy, they are pretty much stable, long tenor kind of very yield like returns giving assets, and they are very bankable. At least they are more bankable than the other counterparts. So it is something where we would see a bit of financing flows coming from yield-focused infra investors. So once they stabilize, these can be pooled into an InvIT kind of a structure. So these would be rather stable, because they give a concession period of about 25 years quite uniformly, I think. So that is more stable. So that's one kind of investors that from whom we will see financing flows. Similarly, pump storage, of course, is slightly different because there is a long gestation period with construction risk. But once they're operating, and that will be possibly after 6-7 years, and that's quite a long gestation period. But after that, there's a 30 to 40-year project period. So these are long-term infra. They would attract funding from, say, sovereign or pension funds and all that. So that is the ideal kind of money which would eventually possibly flow into these kind of spaces. The riskiest part, and probably the most, I would say, the most exciting and also the most challenging part, is the standalone battery storage category, which is obviously very sensitive, because there are certain technology risks in terms of the premature battery degradation, and there are other aspects which are related to the thermal stability of lithium chemistry and all that. But they're also the current formats of projects, they are not getting the kind of value stack, as they say, that they are only being paid for the capacity availability. But shortly we are going to see a lot of these ancillary services being opened up, which where each battery is going to act, has a very autonomous role in terms of being able to instantly correct frequency deviations which are very localized. Now, currently that kind of opening up has not happened, but there is a lot of interest from equity, if not from the debt point of view, in the standalone BESS category, because they are looking at this kind of opening of the market, which actually would open up that entire value stack, and also because the battery prices are going to go down. So here again, there's a different class of investors which we may be looking at, which would be very storage focused platforms, or infra funds and all that. So despite all of these being project finance, there are various different categories of stakeholders whom these would attract in terms of the financial stakeholders, so to say. And so I think that is, but I think going forward we would see a lot of thrust on creating more and more of battery capacity, because that is the need of the hour. Today, I think I have a figure of from June 2025. The current energy, the battery's capacity is about 490 megawatt hour, and this has to rise to somewhere around 35 gigawatt hour by 27, and more than 230 by 32, and again close to 2000 by 47, 48. So we are looking at order of magnitude jumps over the decades, and so this is something which will be a lot of a lot of mind will be put. The government will continue to be the key procurer of these assets going forward. There's also going to be a lot of thrust on creating the green energy corridors through the phase 1 and 2, obviously, but also phase 3, which is proposed. And so these would obviously be funded, will continue to funded by budgetary sources, but with support from MDBs. And of course, this is the place where possibly green bonds can come in and get international funding at reasonable rates for these very high capex projects. The other area I think where one should talk of is basically looking at the new battery chemistries. Again, if I may go back to the battery thing, because there are a lot of experimentations which are going on in sodium ion, and here, of course, a very the needle comes back to a very primary stage where you need that catalytic finance in terms of how do you get the proof of concepts in all these chemistries, whether it is sodium or vanadium, and in terms of say first loss covers or technology risk guarantees or things like that. I mean, which are going to be very, very catalytic, very, very small in quantum, but looking at some kind of grid pilots which would be implemented in tandem with utilities which are amenable to such partnerships. So I think that is what I would stop there, and that's it. I think I'll take more questions if they come. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Mitra, for that panoramic view of financing the grid. And we'll certainly come back to you another round when we reach there. We now may call Swasti to come. And Swasti, the question that we have for you is, what is the role of public finance in encouraging and developing a market for adaptation finance, particularly given the need to use the social discount rate to value projects? Can mitigation and adaptation work together to improve both their socio-economic impact as well as their bankability? Swasti, over to you. You have about 9-10 minutes.
Thank you, Professor Mohanty. Could I just check if my audio is working well? I've been having some issues since the morning today.
You're very clearly audible, Swasti. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. So thank you for bringing me in on this very important topic, Professor Mohanty. And on behalf of ISD, again, I welcome everyone who is joining us today. As ISD, we have made 2 submissions to the seminal publication, Financing Climate Action, India in a Global Context, which is the backdrop for the discussion today. One was a chapter which is called How to Reform, Target and Shift Domestic Public Finance Effectively, which is the piece of work that ISD is best known for in India, and it draws lessons from the energy financing in India with a focus on public finance. And that is where I'll probably briefly touch upon that chapter and the arguments that we are making in that chapter, but focus a lot of my intervention on the second part of the submission, which was a short, but to me, I think a highly relevant topic on public finance in today's climate reality, and especially for countries like India, which then focuses on social discount rate. So in the first chapter, we discuss India's public financial flows to energy over the past decade. Here we discuss how both the union government and state governments in India have designed and implemented strategies to shift scarce public finance away from carbon-intensive energy sources such as fossil fuels towards clean energy, using this very calibrated remove, target and shift approach. And this is what we sort of put out because I think it's been a very well-designed calibrated response to how do you responsibly then shift public financial flows away from fossil lock-ins. And this was through a mix of subsidy, taxation, and just also pricing. Since the book was published, ISG's team in India has also come out with an update on the topic with the recent publication called Mapping India's Energy Policy 2025. I can drop the link in the chat if folks are interested, where we find that since fiscal year 2014, fossil fuel subsidies have decreased by 70% in India. And fossil fuel subsidies were only 3 times now larger than the quantified clean energy subsidies in fiscal year 2024, which is a huge achievement. This puts India in a committee of nations that has been gradually but consistently shifting public financial flows towards scaling up clean energy programs, and how these reforms have actually helped create the fiscal headroom to do so. So there's interesting lessons from the bigger piece that we put out, and the report and the book sort of draws a chapter from that. So if folks are interested who are attending this webinar, I highly encourage you to go through the piece that we put out on the broader theme of public financial flows on energy. Today, I want to spend some time though on our second submission, which focuses more and is quite relevant for adaptation finance. And for this, we raise this fundamental question. It's like this founding first principle questions that how do we value benefits that occur decades into the future? And how do we value benefits which include avoided emissions, avoided flood losses, for example, heat adaptation savings, and cleaner cities in public investment decisions? And this question basically raises this fundamental question of where is scarce public finance, or so as to say, even in cases like India, where private finance is largely channelized through state-owned enterprises, where should this scarce public finance where should it be best put to use, or is being best put to use in India's climate reality? And in the book, we bring out that in the context of climate change policy making, where questions of intergenerational and intragenerational equity are critical, these are ethical questions, which link back to the right choice of social discount rate, and are therefore critical to policy choices for climate action. I'll just maybe spend 1 minute to explain social discount rates in case folks are uninitiated on that topic. Social discount rates are used to conduct economic analysis or cost-benefit analysis of public investments, and therefore they are critical determining which climate projects get filtered for public finance and are particularly useful for governments in evaluating public investment. Now, this is relevant also because of another important development where we are seeing that Government of India is also making a concerted push for higher capital expenditure to improve the quality of budgetary expenditure. We see that in the energy sector alone, there has been a 22% growth in capex by state-owned enterprises. But a large section of this still remains locked into fossils. So in that sense, therefore, social discount rates are pivotal in determining what gets crowd in and what gets crowds out through public investments. So social discount rates make a huge difference to policies where benefits occur in the distant future, especially. Such as climate positive interventions. And just to maybe illustrate this very quickly, a lower social discount rate is required to encourage sustainable projects that have large long-term positive externalities increasingly into the long-term future. This can work in favor of avoiding the cost of reducing emissions now, and vice versa for low discount rates. Put simply, if we choose a high discount rate, future benefits shrink rapidly because of discounting. They become invisible in today's appraisal. If we choose a lower rate, future avoided climate losses are treated as socially valuable today. So for example, if a project saves 100 rupees of climate damage 30 years from now, discounting that at 12%, which is also the popular rate that is adopted in India, and is a rate associated with capital scarce economy, shrinks the present value dramatically. But if you discount the same thing at 6% or lower, a rate often used by multilateral institutions, for example, the World Bank for climate projects in India, keeps long-term resilience benefits visible and economically compelling. And this distinction matters not just in spreadsheet, it shapes policy commitment and investment flows. And that's the primary argument we are building in the chapter Back to the Future in this book, which I sort of contributed with Professor Mohanty to highlight this issue in many traditional climate economic models. I think all this abstract theory sort of links back to what is then the general practice in India for social discount rate, as I touched upon very briefly earlier. In India, the Government of India has been issuing guidelines for project appraisal periodically, including processes and evaluation parameters such as discount rates. The national guidelines for project appraisal stipulate that projects must yield a minimum 12% financial and economic internal rate of return for the purpose of investment approval. And this is a criteria that has largely remained unchanged since the 90s. There are examples and cases of projects where, on a case-to-case basis, this has been either relaxed, or it has been reformed, or it has been tweaked. But generally speaking, as a principle, that's the number that we sort of aim towards. The second thing is that India also adopts something called the social opportunity cost approach to calculating the social discount rate, which I don't want to get into a lot of detail, but there are other approaches to actually sort of calculating the social discount rate for countries. We've seen this, for example, in countries like UK, Norway, Sweden, the Western counterparts, where increasingly to calculate the social discount rate, there is another approach that is put to use, which is the SRTP approach, which is the social time preference approach. And this raises a question, right? Like, is there a need to then sort of revisit in the climate reality that we sit today in, where India is living in a reality where we will need a lot more adaptation finance to sort of revisit what that social discount rate is for us as a society. And India is no exception to this general trend as well. The developing countries overall have stuck to this entire concept of using the social opportunity cost approach to calculating and fixing the social discount rate. And India is just a committee in that nation of developing countries. So given the structural changes in the Indian economy since liberalization and the imperatives of climate change, what we are suggesting through the book and the contribution is that maybe there is a need to revisit the underlying approach and assumptions of India's social discount rate and explore if a lower social discount rate could help unlock public finance, especially for sustainability projects, especially for climate-centric projects that require patient capital, long-term lock-ins, where benefits may accrue much later in like 30 years, 50 years, maybe even 100 years. And if there is a second round of discussion, I'm happy to come back to how, for example, some other countries like UK are thinking about social discount rates, which is laid out in terms of principles in the Green Book, and how, for example, MDBs are using that for India, just as a best practice. But let me pause there, Professor Mohanty, and turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Swasti. As always, very nicely and clearly conveyed what is a very technical subject. May I now invite Dhruvo Prokayasta, who's our final panelist on this, to certainly not one of our most distinguished panelists. And so, Dhruvo, if I may turn to you, with the USA pulling out of the Paris Agreement and other climate institutions, can the rest of the world reconfigure climate finance flows to make good the gap? Can Global South and the EU work in partnership to alleviate the concerns of small island nations through effective loss and damage and provide additional financial flows to Africa that so desperately needs it? Over to you, Dhruv.
Thank you, Professor Mohanty, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you, ISD, for inviting me into the discussion. Before I get to answering Professor Mohanty's question, just wanted to add and agree with what Swasti said on a lower discount rate for public finance, or rather advocate for a zero discount rate for climate adaptation investments for sure, and also maybe part negative, and alternatively there's a need to set up an intergenerational fund actually, or a reparation fund to compensate. So just adding on to what Swasti said and kind of taking it forward in terms of agreeing, my answer to your question is it is possible but will not happen. The point here is the world has shifted away. One famous economist, Nobel Prize winner, quite a long time ago, about 15 years ago, had talked about a trilemma, and that's Danny Roderick. He said globalization, sovereignty, and democracy, you have to choose two. The world has already chosen. It is not globalization, it is sovereignty. Therefore, what has happened is climate is no more a global public good and definitely not adaptation. So, adaptation is a local problem to be addressed locally. So, the question is with the US pulling out, it is not only the US aid and the US amount of money pulling out, it is shifting the world order to a completely new paradigm where the world order has shifted. It's not a rule based order. It is not a rule based order. It is an economic and a military power based order to a certain extent, significantly, and therefore the question of adaptation of the whole principles have got now. We can wait for a few years and see, but at this present moment, can EU and the rest of the developing South cooperate to make it happen? Well, yes, but then the choice that emanates out as we have dropped globalization any which way, we have dropped global public goods very clearly stated. So therefore, adaptation is there is climate change in which true the adaptation can salvage small island states. Well, it is possible, but where is I don't see an institutional system to make it happen. Theoretically, is it possible to encompass and pass kind of collective, I would say collective public finance mobilization? I'll give a small alternative here and leave it. Adaptation, in some way, the impact of climate change is only on this side of the world. If you look at the map of physical risk, you will find clearly Europe and America, North America, excluded from impacts of climate change or the severe impacts for climate change, even if there are few hurricanes happening. You will see all the red areas coming into Asia and Pacific Asia. Look at any map. German watch. So what I'm basically saying is it is possible to regionally create regional platforms. And the first thing that is required to be done in that case is to probably create an Asian or a BRICS IMF of sorts so that you exclude the global north from these mechanisms. Therefore, the savings of Asia is high savings. We fund consumption in the global north, right? So you can trap the high Asian savings and reinvest that back in adaptation in the Pacific Asia region. So that's where I want to end. It is possible, but these global institutional mechanisms needs an Asian green, green bank, call it an Asian IMF for climate, call it by a new order of SDRs being issued, climate SDRs. These can be done to effect these changes, but expecting this EU, US has having withdrawn, that has clearly redefined the world geopolitics, the world order. The transition is already, I would say, happening unless there's some serious attempts to claw it back, which I don't see it now. So therefore, the overall contribution towards global public goods is going down and would go down. Thank you.
Thank you, Dhruv, for that. It was a very, very interesting comments, and hopefully there will be other opportunities for us to take that up, particularly at organizing at the Asian level. Before we look for a second round of questions, there have been some questions in the chat box. Let me put some of them to you and see if we get. So Sambit Basu has said that the problem is, how do you get entities responsible to pay to actually bring finance to the table and finance at scale? There's nothing for them to comply or commit. This is the moot point that never gets addressed in any forum or meetings and discussion. In continuation to my previous question, how do we move beyond the theory to look at what we do in practice, doable solutions? Front load all costs for now and future benefits, but who pays? So if I may put this to the panel, that a lot of the time we are having theoretical discussions rather than taking up small or taking up issues which can be solved. For example, if you front load the costs, right? As somebody is saying, would it work? Can I start with you, Swasti, on that? Swasti?
Yeah, thanks, Professor Mohanty. I don't think there is an easy answer to this difficult question. How do you sort of do this? But I think just in terms of front loading the costs, this is, I think, where I think it's important to recognize what India has experimented with. And because we are talking in the context of India, there's lots of examples globally about around how, for example, countries are experimenting with carbon taxes, carbon markets. But I think when we think about India, India has had a history of experimenting with an explicit carbon tax, which was also the proceeds of which were also hypothecated. And that was a good use of how do you front load the cost. But we kind of lost it during the COVID pandemic because again, like countries like India, which have development needs, had to raise finance during the COVID pandemic relief. And what interestingly sort of we find in our work is one can even argue that we shifted a lot of the production taxes on fossil fuel companies to actually a consumption tax. And that is something that, needs a lot more investigation in terms of how do you then think about more taxation reforms that then are ensuring that there is an underlying polluter pays principle in the way we use our tax policy, which is then not passing it on to the consumers, but actually on the producers that may not be taking as much responsibility of, some of these costs. So again, like these are small examples of how maybe we can think about front loading the cost. But again, I will bring it back to that underlying principle of also what public investments largely do in terms of how do we think about discounting for the future. And that is the second, second sort of like lens that we need to take, that as a country collectively, how do we think about that intergenerational equity, how do we think about long-term benefits, the co-benefits in the future, and think about monetization pathways of that, because right now we don't have anything around there. Most of the long-term benefits are unaccounted for. We don't have a financial system that is monetizing any of it right now. So how do you bring that as a principle into the financial system, starting with public investments, because that's where governments can sort of mobilize guidelines, principles, and frameworks to then make the entire financial system move. So I'll pause there. Again, it's a theoretical answer, I think, to a question that raises practical concerns. But I'm sure other panelists can maybe come in to illustrate that better.
Thank you. And again, you put that very nicely. It is true that we do need to look at practical solutions, but some of these have been tried, and like you said, they have worked, and so we should go back and see why we stopped. Klaus Radunsky has a question, which says that.
Prior to that, I think Dhruba also has an answer to the previous question.
He does? Sorry. Yes, Dhruba, go on.
Thanks. Just a short point, Mrityunjay. The point which Swasti was making, very relevant and valid. Just wanted to add, the carbon prices need to be recognized in financial accounting. If you recognize carbon prices as depreciation, you have got your bottom line done. It's a non-cash charge. So therefore, you get in sinking fund on the other side in private sector. But for that, you basically need to change accounting standards, IFRS, and then Ind AS or whichever way. That accounting standard needs to change to reflect that. And point number 2, front-loading costs is also the same as lowering discount rates. So the discount rates do not get lowered. costs do not get front-loaded, but you have to shift the measurement mechanism in accounting, and the measurement surplus in accounting, which does send a signal, whether it is public or private sector, is almost the same. I just wanted to lay kind of add to this point on next possibility of how it can be done. Thanks.
No, thanks, Dhruv, for that. The accounting change that you're suggesting is very important. Number one. Number two, it's actually doable. If people put their minds to it, if the accounting change is doable, and if it's doable, then it opens the other avenues, like you pointed out. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. The next question that Klaus Rudinsky is actually posed has to do with the social cost of carbon. He's saying that based on the polluter pays principle, is it not appropriate to look at the social cost of carbon as a measure of appropriate amount of climate finance? So Dhruv, may I ask you to respond to this?
No, that's absolutely the case. It is the social cost. So the question is, how do you price carbon? You do it either through tax or through markets, in terms of whatever you do through markets. But the question is, it needs to find a place. And where it needs to find a place is in accounting. The concept is correct, but we don't know how to implement it. Therefore, you need to recognize this in regulation and recognize this in measurement of, I would say, financial accounting, because that's what is the basis which drives the measurement of everything, whether it is capital or corporate performance or even public sector to that extent, but not taking away the fact that discounting rate for public finance for climate projects has to come down, complemented by how you can get the private enterprise internalize and therefore get to that polluter pays dimension onto standards and measurement. Yes, that's the point. I agree, and the way to take it forward is this: we have to change the measurements of price carbon in financial accounting, and then everything else follows.
Thank you for that. The next question that I would like us there is some level of understanding that this is from somebody who hasn't signed in with a name. There is some level of understanding that billions or trillions remains more or less an empty slogan for development. Probably more so for climate too. Do the expert in the panel concur? Is it time for a wholly different paradigm change? Suranjali, might I ask you to respond to this?
Yeah, I think if we're presuming that India is going to be a developed country by 2047, I think the narrative for countries like India also has to shape differently internally. Cannot go and request for more climate finance when there is potential for us to mobilize resources domestically. And I think the point's been made about limited resources available in countries abroad. There's already debt to GDP is extremely high for the developed countries. So the expectation that resources will be mobilized through conversations at multilateral organizations is, I think, a little staid. It's more important to look at what resources you're available, and I guess it is a function of how you set your growth targets, how what you see as a potential for decarbonizing.
Okay, thank you for that, Suranjali. The next question that we have is from Nikita Shukla. Even if India lowers the social discount rate and makes adaptation projects more economically worthwhile, how do we solve the institutional bottleneck of actually mobilizing finance, especially in a world where global climate cooperation is weakening? I think, we have addressed that bit of it, but I would like to come back to Mr. Debal Mitra. Mr. Mitra, you made a remark in a bit in the passing, which I would like you to address, that SECI has stepped in as a market maker.
Yep.
Now, can you take us through how SECI, first, if you can just spell out SECI, SECI, and in the full form for people who might not know SECI, and can you just take us how SECI is trying to create this market? Because if SECI can succeed being a market maker, it actually will make a very big difference to mobilizing money from discoms for discoms.
So it is SECI stands for Solar Energy Corporation of India, and it has come up as a nodal authority for procurement of renewable energy and related kind of projects all across the country. And it is actually why I said it is a market maker is that and it links back to the point that or the I would say the long understood aspect of discoms being the weakest link, and there's a how does a generator actually how do you get in private kind of interest from private project developers and private investors into this whole sector unless and until you address the basic issue of counterparty risk, and that of course is sorted to some extent. So one is basically it is creating a market by coming in as a counterparty on both sides. So it is procuring power from the project developers, and it also has a power sale agreement with the discoms, and it is in between. So when if I am generating power, then I have a contract with SECI, so I am more kind of safer and secure. So instead of I having to deal with some state utility which has a very low credit rating. So that is one. The second is basically the agility with which it has kind of, I would say, created new formats or thought of new formats, and it has been in step with the needs which are very techno commercial and which are also I would say it is in tandem with the energy trajectory of the country, and obviously in terms of how do we make RE more usable. And that's why I said the issue is not about technology and finance, because the whole thing comes down to how we are planning the energy trajectory and how we are ensuring that more and more of renewable gets absorbed. Because when we are looking at a certain target of 500 gigawatts, and then beyond that about 750 gigawatts is being thought of. Obviously, the critical point is that we should have that absorbed capacity, and that can only happen if we are actually making it the mainstay, power, energy format, and slowly replacing. Of course, that's going to take a long time to happen, but slowly, if we have to make it as usable or as kind of seamlessly integrated with conventional power, then we need to kind of integrate it. We need to make it more dispatchable and firm. And SECI is actually creating those projects. So it is swiftly moving from one kind of projects to another. So as I said that the round the clock tenders were there, and then it's sensing the market that okay, there are a lot of cancellations from the discom side because the prices discovered were not something that they had appetite for. So they moved into a very decentralized, very flexible format, and which is basically that you look at only standalone battery energy storage tenders, where you procure that only for the capacity being available and during the peak period. I mean, for the charging and discharging cycle. So these are the kind of things. That's why I said the SECI is playing the role of a market maker as well as a kind of taking care of the counterparty risk.
Thank you for explaining that, Mr. Mitra. And we now bring to close this panel discussion, and I'll hand it over to my colleague Runa to wrap it up. What has been a really fascinating conversation. Runa, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mrityunjoy, and thank you to all our panelists and ISD for putting this together. And indeed, it's been a journey. And if you think about it, we started out with Tara, who kind of summarized the outcomes of both the G20 and COP30, and therefore, set the context. And this was very elegantly followed up by Dr. Deepak Dasgupta, who went ahead and talked about pragmatic solutions to this context. And his major contribution was saying, hey, one of the things that COP30 says is let's not wait till we have a consensus of 180 plus countries on something. If you have a good idea, let's start on it, let's work on a proof of concept, and then let's scale it up little by little. And he actually gave a very good example of the global finance hub that is trying to be, that he and many of us are actually trying to set up in the eastern region, considering that of all the regions within India, it's the eastern and northeastern regions that are most vulnerable to climate change. And Dr. Dasgupta's very, very interesting ideas about smaller groups, about coalitions, about bootstrapping, and so on, was followed up by Saranjali, who then talked about what was India as a country doing about adaptation, and how seriously was India taking adaptation and recognizing the need to move with mitigation and adaptation, or move with both simultaneously. And the good news is that, India passes with flying colors. Right? There's good things happening. You specifically, actually, Suranjali talked about instances highlighted in the economic survey where actually initiatives have been highlighted as to what could be done. And my major takeaway from that was it's never going to be a one size fits all solution. And indeed, therefore, different projects would have different answers and different ways of handling this. And the specificity indeed was taken up next when Dr. Mohanty asked Mr. Mitra very specifically to talk about one issue, which is the grids and energy transmission and distribution, and how that, in the context of mitigation now, could be a bottleneck. And once again, what they were highlighted to us was it was not about technology or finance or technology and finance, but actually links across planning, across balance sheets, across the state of our discoms, across policies, across the various types of energy generations that we are looking at, across different storage solutions, and how each of these have to work together. So what, again, I took back was the specificity of it all. And it was brilliant how you linked this then to the various different types of instruments along with each project. So an INVIT for a different project, a green bond for a different project, and how each of these different instruments have to work together. Of course, this was followed, and it's, by now everybody is doing such a fantastic job that Swasti had a hard job to follow up on this great work, talking about the social discount rates. And indeed, as expected, you again came out with flying colors, once again highlighting that, number one, the country's done a good job in terms of reducing its subsidies to just 3 times that of fossil fuels for renewables. So that's good news. But clearly that's not enough. And explaining the need to relook at how one processes the social discount rate and recognizing the need to actually do that to ensure funding of projects going forward, I think was a very, very important contribution that you made. And once again, I think it was the ones, that the fact that one size does not fit all, right? So 6% for the MDBs right now, 12% is what India says. But if one actually goes and works with social opportunity costs, you may get different numbers. And maybe one may have to think of different numbers for different kinds of projects. Who knows? So understanding and recognizing how to do it. And indeed, in this context, the questions that were brought in by the audience brought to light the fact that it need not be just a social discount rate. Front-loading the costs would have any kind of similar effects. So alternatives to how to do it were also brought out brilliantly by this very, very interesting group of panelists as well as participants. Dr. Dhruva Purakasto, as usual, can be very direct and can give you good news and not so good news. And in this context, he was not in the most optimistic frame of mind, where he very clearly said that, you know what, forget global public good, forget common but differentiated responsibilities. You are the one who's going to suffer from adaptation. You'd better gear up and figure out how to deal with it. And if you're going to gear up and figure out how to deal with it, very interestingly, he circled back to what Dr. Deepak Dasgupta started at, which was regional cooperation, which was platforms, NDB reforms, and so on. So in some senses, I really need not have concluded this session because you did that for me in the way this went across, but indeed a very, very enjoyable session. Thank you, Dr. Mohanty, for taking us through this, and thank you, Priyami and Madhulika, for anchoring this entire process. Thank you to all the participants for being here on this Thursday evening. Over to you, Priyami.
Thank you so much, Luna, for summarizing it so clearly and so precisely for all of us. And thank you, Professor Mohanty, for moderating the entire session so beautifully and tying up all the knots together. So we all have our takeaways. And thanks to all the distinguished panelists for your time, for your insights, and for this shared commitment to advance the agenda of global climate finance. And finally, thanks to all the participants for your patient listening and also for asking all the questions that has made the discussion even more invigorating and enlightening for all of us. So we look forward to meeting you again in our next webinar of the series. Till then, have a good nice day. Thanks to all.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.